Hi, we're going to get started. My name is Chris Green. I'd like to start by thanking all the generous sponsors that made today's event possible. The Harvard Association of Law and Business, the Student Enterprise Law Association, the HLS Food Law Society, the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund, and the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. Now, I personally always hate when I'm speaking somewhere and I have to sit there in front of the room while someone else reads off my resume. It just feels sort of awkward, but it's still not going to prevent me from bringing my good friend Bruce through that same agony here today. Bruce simply is one of the most compassionate and strategically brilliant human beings I've had the good fortune to know. Throughout his many phases of life, he's put that passion into practice, from running a homeless shelter in Washington, D.C., to teaching in the D.C. public school system, to running PETA's largest division, to serving as Farm Sanctuary's Director of Policy and Advocacy, which is how we got to know each other first. And in the midst of that last role, Bruce still found time to graduate with honors from Georgetown Law School. And I think in the past year alone, he's having 4 separate law review articles published. Scores of other papers and periodicals have published his opinion pieces, and nearly every television news outlet you can name has had him on as a guest. The animal advocacy community was extremely excited to learn of Bruce's latest venture, founding the Good Food Institute and New Crop Capital. And actually, they are a client of Harvard's own Food Law and Policy Clinic as well. So I'll get out of the way so he can tell you all about that. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Friedrich to Harvard Law School.
Hello. So basically what that introduction proves is that I can't keep a job. Anyway, I want to thank Chris and Sandeep and all of the sponsoring organizations for inviting me to chat with you today, and also want to thank all of you for turning up. I sincerely appreciate it to have a conversation today about food technology, venture capital, and the future of food. I want to start by polling the audience. If I had been a little bit more prepared, I would have put a plate of falafel up here instead of a plate of pasta, since that's what everybody is eating. But who here likes pasta? Wow, we have almost unanimity on like for pasta. Who here would go to your refrigerator, take out 9 plates of pasta, these 9 plates of pasta, dump them in the trash, and eat 1 plate of pasta? A couple of people like one like this. There are a few people who aren't sure whether they want life on Earth to continue. Bring on ecocide. Dump it all, throw it all away. But not many. Most people, I have found, are concerned about food waste. So this will probably be the third question that I ask you, hopefully the last. Who here is concerned about food waste? Yeah, we have even the people who are going to throw the 9 plates of pasta in the trash are having a little bit of trouble because they're concerned about food waste. And it's concerning, right? The fact that we are throwing away about 40% of all of the food that's produced is concerning. But the thing about how we do agriculture now, and especially how we do animal agriculture now, is that it is the equivalent every time we consume even the most efficient animal products. It's the equivalent of throwing away 9 calories in food for every calorie that we consume. And this just makes intuitive sense. So I weigh about 180 pounds. If I do nothing but lay in bed watching reruns of The Apprentice, I'm going to burn like 2,000 calories a day. When something exciting is happening on the screen and I'm, fire him, Donald, fire him! Then it ticks up a little bit when I get excited. That same sort of relationship, caloric, physiological relationship, is true of farm animals. Not obviously that they lay in bed watching bad television, but that the vast majority of the calories that you feed to a chicken or a pig or a cow or any animal, the vast majority of the calories that you feed to the animal expends simply existing. So that the most efficient meat, which is chicken, requires 9 calories in the form of corn or soy or oats or alfalfa or whatever is turned into chicken feed, requires 9 calories in to get 1 calorie back out. And that means every time we choose to eat meat, we're essentially entering into a relationship wherein the vast majority of the food that we're consuming is completely wasted. It's expended by the animal simply existing. And that's just the first problem of the food system as it exists now, specifically the food system as it applies to animal products. So I'm going to be talking about seeds of disruption, venture capital technology, and the future of food. I'm going to start by talking about why the future of food, and especially animal protein, needs to be different. And I'll be briefly discussing 4 issues, including that first one, the lack of sustainability. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the food technologies that are particularly exciting and particularly disruptive of animal agriculture. And then finally, I'll be talking about how and why venture capitalists are so excited about specifically disrupting animal agriculture and creating a different and a better food system. So the 4 issues I'm going to discuss, the first is sustainability. So what our current food system does to the global poor. Secondly is a complement of that, and it's environmentalism, the environmental harm, especially with regard to climate change, of raising animals for food. Then I'll talk briefly about health, and then I'll talk briefly about animal welfare. So the first issue is global poverty, and the fact that it takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out in the form of feed. It takes more than 9 if you're talking about farmed fish, or you're talking about turkeys, or you're talking about pigs, or you're talking about cattle. It goes up to about 23 to 25 calories in for a cow, who is the most inefficient, to get 1 calorie back out. But all of it involves big, big problems. On an individual basis, maybe not such a big deal. Writ large across 9 billion farm animals in the US alone, that is an almost unbelievable amount of food waste. A lot more than 9 plates of pasta once you multiply it by all of the meat meals that are consumed on an annual basis. A couple of years ago, this guy, Jean Ziegler, who is the UN's global envoy on food, he called biofuels a crime against humanity. And he said it's a crime against humanity because 100 million metric tons of corn and grain are grown and then fed to are grown and then turned into biofuels, so turned into energy, while at this point, close to 1 billion people were living in nutritional deficit. Nutritional deficit, it's a euphemism. They're not taking in enough calories to sustain basic life functioning, they're starving. And every year, tens of millions of people do starve or do die from starvation-related causes. So his thesis was, Ziegler's thesis was, that it is a crime against humanity to take 100 million metric tons of corn and grain and turn them into biofuels. Well, this is reality for hundreds of millions of other human beings. Who thinks that, who thinks, at least on its face, that's a tenable argument? Here I am, I've got you raising your hands again. Who thinks that makes sense? Yeah, most people, we probably want to dive into it a little bit more, find out about the precise relationships, but most people, it makes sense that if you're taking 100 million metric tons of edible foods and turning them into fuel, while tens of millions of people are dying every year from starvation-related causes, we understand it doesn't even take economics 101 to know that there's going to be competition there for grains, and that some people, like this, are going to end up priced out. But the thing is, that same report, that was, Ziegler was referring to a Food and Agriculture Organization report. That same report found that 756 million metric tons of corn and grain were turned into animal feed. So 100 million metric tons turned into biofuels, more than 7.5 times as many corn and grains put into that vastly inefficient relationship wherein we grow the crops, we feed those crops to farm animals, and the farm animals burn off 90% at least, more than 95% if you're talking about cattle, burn off 90 to 96% of the caloric energy, vast waste. So if it's a crime against humanity to turn crops into biofuels, arguably an even worse crime against humanity to turn crops into food for farm animals. And that doesn't even include soy. So of the 285 roughly million metric tons of soy that were grown that year, about 85% of that soy, so more than 200 billion metric tons, were also turned into animal feed. So this is probably the world's largest banner ever created. It says KFC Amazon Criminal. It's a Greenpeace banner. That's one person there, one person there, one person there, one person there. I don't think the Guinness Book actually has a world's largest banner category, but Greenpeace should petition for it because I think they'd win it. And this is KFC Amazon Criminal. It's in a soy field in South America, and Greenpeace was drawing attention to the fact that the Amazon rainforest is being chopped down both for cattle grazing. Most people in this room probably are familiar with that, but even more so, especially now in the era of free trade agreements, even more so it's being chopped down to grow feed grains, and those feed grains are shipped to the United States, to Canada, to other Western countries in order to feed farm animals. So World Watch put it this way. They said continued growth in meat output is dependent on feeding grain to animals, creating competition for grain between affluent meat eaters and the world's poor. In other words, what anybody in this room knows from basic economics, if you have a demand for 1,000 million metric tons of something, that demand is going to drive up the price, and for the people who have nothing to eat, they are going to be priced out entirely. Oxfam International put it this way. They said eating less meat is a simple way to reduce pressure on global resources and help ensure that everybody has enough to eat. And this is the first big question in food tech that alternatives to animal agriculture answer. So if you go to food tech VC conferences, the two big issues are where are we going to find enough food to feed 9 billion people? We're not going to do it with the vast inefficiency represented by animal agriculture. And the second one I'll be talking about in just a second, and that's climate change. But first, stepping back on the climate change issue, just to go with sort of an intuitive explanation. So I think it makes perfect sense. I imagine everybody understands the idea that if you're growing crops to feed them to animals, the animals are going to expend the vast majority of those calories simply existing, so that it takes a lot more crops if you're going to feed them to farm animals than if you're going to turn them into human food directly. But it's not just that inefficiency that's the problem. So all agriculture creates a lot of pollution, and all agriculture is energy intensive. So if you're going to create vegan foods, plant-based foods, you still have to grow the crops, and that takes irrigation and resources and causes pollution. And then you have to ship the crops to the factory where you turn them into whatever vegan food you're going to be eating. And then you ship that to the supermarket, and each stage it's gas guzzling pollution spewing vehicles, it's factories that are polluting and resource intensive. It has problems. The thing about animal agriculture is you still have to do all that, except that you then have to do more. So you still have to grow the crops, except now you're shipping the crops to a feed mill, and you're operating the feed mill. And then you're shipping the feed to the industrial farm, or even the non-industrial farm, and you're operating the farm. And then you're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse, and you're operating the slaughterhouse. And then you're shipping, it's about 3 or 4 extra energy-intensive polluting factories and multiple extra stages of gas-guzzling, pollution-spewing vehicles. So the United Nations released a report, over 400-page report called Livestock's Long Shadow, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and they found that animal agriculture is one of the most significant contributors to the most serious environmental problems at every scale from local to global, that animal agriculture contributes to problems of land degradation, climate change and air pollution, water shortage and water pollution, and loss of biodiversity. And in fact, with all of these issues, they found that animal agriculture, every issue in environmentalism, from the smallest and most local to the largest and most global, that because of the inefficiencies in the extra stages of production that I was just discussing, animal agriculture is one of the top 3 causes of all of these issues. And then on the environmental issue that is arguably most pressing, certainly the one we hear the most about, climate change, animal agriculture causes 40% more global warming than all the SUVs, 18-wheelers, jumbo jets, all forms of transportation combined. So animal agriculture is responsible for about 18% of all climate change globally, whereas transport is responsible for about 13% of all transport globally. So back to the most efficient form of animal agriculture, which is chicken. Chicken produces, each calorie of chicken that somebody consumes produces about 54 grams of CO2 equivalent. Each calorie of legumes, including soy, that somebody consumes produces about 2. So it is literally the case that chicken causes, on a calorie per calorie basis, causes 27 times as much climate change as one of the key alternatives, which would be soy. And if what you're concerned about is calories from protein, it gets even worse. So chicken produces 40 times more CO2 equivalent on a calorie per calorie basis if what you're trying to do is get calories of protein. So probably the thing most of us think about when we think about climate change, the thing most of us think about is transportation. So 2 statistics, one from the Sierra Club. Sierra Club found that cutting meat consumption by just about 20% is the equivalent of switching from a sedan to a hybrid. And Environmental Defense said that if every American skipped 1 meal of chicken per week and substituted vegetarian foods instead, the carbon dioxide savings would be the same as taking more than 500,000 cars off of US roads. About a year and a half ago, Chatham House, which is the foremost think tank in Europe, Chatham House released this report, Livestock, Climate Change's Forgotten Sector, in which they decried both the degree to which environmental organizations and governments that are focused on climate change are not dealing with this issue. They said without severe cuts in consumption, agricultural emissions will take up the world's entire carbon budget by 2050. Shifting global demand for meat and dairy products is central to achieving climate goals. So as most people in this room probably know, there are about 150 government representatives gathered in New York City today to sign the Paris Agreement and to make it binding. What Chatham House is saying is that it is a literal impossibility that any of those governments can possibly make their climate obligations under the Paris Agreement to keep climate change to under 2 degrees Celsius by 2050 unless they deal with animal agriculture. And so far, at least, none of them are doing it. So this is an important issue on an individual basis, but it could not be more serious and could not be more important when we look at it on a global scale. The last 2 issues I'm going to talk about are human health and animal protection, and I'm going to go through those a lot more quickly. When you go to food tech conferences, there's some discussion of human health. There's generally no discussion unless I'm on the panel of animal welfare. But they are also, I mean, there's a lot to be said for switching away from animal agriculture on the basis of both of those issues. So I have 2 slides that are text heavy, and this is one of them. So prepare, steel yourself as we begin to read this slide. I know you're in law school, you're used to professors with like every slide at 900 words. So it's a good crowd for being steeled to death by PowerPoint. But the American Heart Association says a diet that emphasizes plant-based foods compared to animal-based foods can lower the risk of dying of heart disease or stroke by 20%. And heart disease is the #1 killer in the United States. It kills more than half of men. So you take up everything that kills people in the United States, and at least among men, heart disease outweighs everything else put together. And for women, it's awfully close. It's over 40% for women. We can cut it by 20% by cutting down on our intake of animal products. The American Institute for Cancer Research, when it comes to American health, the research shows one thing very clearly. We all need to eat more plants and less meat. So the number 2 killer, cancer. About 35% of cancer is diet related. About 35% of cancer has to do with tobacco use. And the American Institute for Cancer Research is telling us that we should all be cutting back on animal product consumption in order to prevent cancer. The Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, looking at more issues, says a strong body of scientific evidence links excess meat consumption with heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, obesity, certain cancers, and early death. So So Johns Hopkins is looking at all of the literature, and the American Dietetic Association confirms this, pointing out that people, the more meat you cut out of your diet, the more likely you are to not suffer from these diseases of affluence. And then actually just about 2 weeks ago, the National Academy of Sciences put out a report saying that a shift away from meat consumption could cut global premature mortality by 6 to 10%. And if you pull up this report, what they say is, if people were to eat the amount of meat that Harvard Medical School suggests, which is basically 2 portions a week, that would cut premature mortality by about 6%. And then as people went to no meat and no animal products at all, it goes up to 9 and 10%. So there's really a scientific consensus on the point that pretty much everybody should be consuming fewer animal products, which would make these products ripe for disruption as well. And then finally, animal protection. I know the Harvard Solid has done a really nice job of bringing in speakers who are talking about animal protection issues, especially in the law context. But just to say, this is what a chicken shed looks like. And chickens have a wingspan of about 30 to 32 inches. Each bird in one of these sheds gets about 9 by 9 inches. So it really just, you sometimes see sheds when the birds are babies, and it doesn't look like a carpet of chickens. But this is at less than 6 weeks. Chickens are slaughtered when they're on average about 41 to 42 days old. And this is a chart that was in the Wall Street Journal at the end of March, so just a couple of weeks ago. And the thing I want to draw your attention to, the average number of days for a broiler chicken to gain 1 pound was about 45 days in the mid-1920s. It's down to 7.7 days as of 2015. And poultry scientists are telling us that chickens are now growing, their upper bodies are growing about 7 times as quickly as they would naturally. So poultry scientists at the University of Arkansas said that if a human baby grew as quickly as a modern broiler chicken, she would weigh 650 pounds before she was 6 months old. And think about that, a 6-month-old human baby at 650 pounds. That's how quickly modern broiler chickens are growing. They are in chronic pain throughout their entire lives, and they're dying of massive death rates because their hearts can't keep up, and they give out, their lungs can't keep up, and they fail. Their legs can't support their massive upper bodies. You walk into one of these chicken sheds, and these birds who are not even 6 weeks old, they're chirping like babies, but they're basically sort of Frankenstein animals. So from an animal protection standpoint, cutting back on animal product consumption at a really big scale would help an awful lot of animals. So those are the 4 issues: sustainability / global poverty, the environment / climate change, health, and animal protection are 4 really big reasons why animal agriculture at least is ripe for disruption. So at the Good Food Institute, that's what we're focused on. We're focused on using markets and food technology to disrupt animal agriculture. And the folks at Chatham House, the people who put out the climate change report where they called livestock the forgotten sector and decried what they called a policy void from both environmentalists and governments in this issue, Chatham House's prescription for change has to do with education. So Chatham House says apparently governments and nonprofit environmental organizations afraid to intrude into people's dining rooms. But Chatham House is saying, we haven't tested that, we don't know how people would react, and what we need to do is educate people. At the Good Food Institute, our suggestion is very different. We think you can take ethics off the table if you look at why people actually make the kind of choices that they make. So there have been roughly 1,000 surveys of why people make the food choices that they make. And pretty much all of them have come to the exact same top 3 conclusions. People make their food choices on the basis of taste, on the basis of price, and on the basis of convenience. I would bet an awful lot that everybody in this room, when you're deciding what you're going to eat, you think about the taste, you think about the price, and maybe you don't think about convenience, but if it's not there to be ordered, you're not going to be able to consume it. And these 4 people, I would bet, that this may be a staged photo, but the vast majority of people, they're thinking, I don't know. The vast majority of people, when they're sitting down to eat, they're not thinking about the environment, they're not thinking about animal welfare, they're not thinking about any of these issues. But if they're buying it, they're thinking about the cost. If they're eating it, they're thinking about the taste. And they're certainly impacted by the convenience, unless they went fabulously out of their way for some great restaurant or something. For the most part, everybody shops at the same grocery stores, and you only buy what your grocery store has available. So those are the things that, those are the issues that we most need to address. And there are a couple of areas where we're focusing. The first is on plant-based meats. So this is Beyond Meat's plant-based chicken strips. When Mark Bittman from the New York Times, the food writer for the New York Times, when he tried these, he said, I have generally been down on the idea of plant-based meats, but I legitimately cannot tell the difference between the Beyond Meat chicken strips and actual, chicken strips from animals. When Bill Gates tried these chicken strips, he was so enthused. He said, what I was tasting was not just a fancy new meat analog. What I was tasting was the future of food, which I think is a great statement. And he was so enthused about it, he wrote a blog, The Future of Food, that talks about plant-based meats disrupting animal agriculture. He had some videos produced in which he had top chefs cooking with Beyond Meat chicken strips. So that's one of the things that I think that we need to get equally convenient, equally delicious, and price competitive. Beyond Meat also has the Beyond Meat Beast Burger, which I think is named for people who want to get maximal protein beast burger. And I can testify that it's really quite good. So that's thing number 1, is the plant-based meats. And then there's cultured meat, which is sometimes called lab-grown meat. But it's not really, it is, you take the cells of a cow or a pig or a chicken or another animal, and you add sugars to cause the cells to grow, and then the cells multiply, and then you have the exact same meat that you would have gotten by feeding a chicken or a pig or another animal, except that it's vastly more efficient. And it's not fair to say, would you eat lab-grown meat? If anybody in this room, probably I'm going to guess most people are meat eaters, but if you were asked, would you eat factory farm meat? Like everybody's going to go, no. Or if you made it even a little bit more graphic, would you eat meat that was steeped in its own feces in a massive filthy feed? Everybody's going to go, no. But it's not lab-grown meat any more than cornflakes are lab-grown, lab-created cornflakes. So yes, the original stages of culturing animal products happens in a lab, just like the original creation of every packaged food to get it to just that cornflakey goodness happens in a lab. But this is what it ends up looking like. It happens in the equivalent of fermenters. So once they have perfected the process, this is what the future of cultured meat production looks like. And once you have this, you have, once you have the product that is equally convenient, cost competitive, and it tastes exactly the same because it is exactly the same, and you have 2 options. One of them is meat that was grown on a farm, which was filthy, slaughtered in a slaughterhouse that was filthy, very likely to have bacteria on it, required antibiotics, astronomical numbers of antibiotics, against clean, safe, 100% transparent meat production. And then another thing, like the transparency issue, states are actually passing laws to make it illegal to find out how factory farms and slaughterhouses operate. They are so non-transparent, they want to make it illegal to find out. Once you've got your friendly neighborhood meat brewery, and you can actually go to the pub and there it's being produced, I think it becomes, especially when it's price competitive and equally convenient, awfully appealing. The third food technology is plant-based dairy products. So these are a little bit more common, I think. Plant-based milk, plant-based cheese. These products are Kite Hill and Miyoko's. And then we were all very happy in the plant-based community when Ben & Jerry's came out with 4 completely plant-based ice creams. So vanilla with chocolate sandwich cookies, banana with fudge, coffee with fudge chunks and a caramel swirl, chocolate with fudge brownies. For those of you who didn't know this existed, you'd be forgiven for like packing up your bags and taking off the Safeway to get some of this stuff because it's fantastic. So plant-based milk, plant-based dairy and eggs, cultured meat, and then cultured other animal products. So this is similar to the idea of culturing meat, except that it doesn't even need a donor animal. So culturing meat, you have sort of one Adam and Eve animal. So it can be a completely painless process. You take a biopsy from a chicken or a pig or a cow. That animal, you get those cells, and you multiply that cells, and that's the meat industry in perpetuity. With these products, which are cultured dairy, cultured eggs, cultured gelatin, you don't even need the donor animal in the first place. So you can isolate the specific proteins, and you can create the proteins and multiply them in yeast or bacteria. So it's basically just sequencing the proteins. And this is exactly how 90% of rennet that's produced in the developed world is created. So up until 1991, 100% of rennet was a product of a calf's stomach. It was part of the inner linings of a calf's stomach. In 1991, the FDA approved a process whereby exactly what I was just talking about. They take yeast, they isolate the rennet proteins, they multiply the proteins in the yeast, and it's called synthetic rennet, and it's in the vast majority of cheese that's produced throughout the developed world. It's also where 100% of insulin comes from. So most people in here probably know that insulin used to come from pigs. Now 100% of insulin is produced in yeast. It's synthetic. And these two companies are like less than 2 years old, and that company's about 8 months old, and they're doing synthetic dairy, synthetic eggs, and synthetic collagen at the moment. So anybody in here who eats eggs is eating products that are produced this way. So we're excited, extremely excited at the Good Food Institute. If you go to food tech conferences, there is a huge buzz around especially plant-based alternatives to animal agriculture, and a growing buzz around cultured alternatives to animal agriculture. And the CEO of Pinnacle Foods summed up one of the reasons when he said that plant-based meats are in the early stages of a macro trend, similar to the way that soy and almond milk changed the milk category. So Pinnacle Foods paid $154 million for Gardein, which is one of the big plant-based meat manufacturers. Anybody in here, if you haven't been to Yard House, I highly encourage you to go to Yard House. They've got an entire menu of Gardein products, and they really are quite terrific. But it's worth noting that Pinnacle Foods is also responsible for Hungry Man and potted meat. When the guy who brings us Hungry Man and potted meat is bullish on plant-based alternatives to animal agriculture, I think you've got something good going. I just want to take a step back and talk about what that means. So he said plant-based meats are in the early stages of a macro trend similar to the way that soy and almond milk changed the milk category. Plant-based milks are currently at about 8% of the milk market. And Mintel just released results this morning saying that plant-based milks in 2015, sales went up 8%, even as sales of dairy milk went down 9%. So they're closing this gap year after year. This is plant-based meat. Plant-based meat is at $500 million on a $200 million meat market, which means that plant-based meat is roughly 1/30th of plant-based milk. And this is what it looks like when they change the gap. So from about 0.25% up to 30 times that at about 8%. And what that means in dollar terms is that we have a $16 billion a year industry that is on the cusp of beginning. Last year, Lux Research released a report They did a food trends analysis of where plant-based meats are now and where plant-based meats are going. And they found that they said that conservatively, they expect plant-based meats to be at a third of the market by 2054. And this is what that looks like. So we're talking about a market that right now is at about $500 million, that all of the analysts are saying is going to be at $16 billion fairly quickly, and by 2054 is going to be at $65 billion every single year. That's why Bill Gates said this. He said, so far we've explored only about 8% of the world's plant proteins as potential meat alternatives. Remaking meat is one sector of the food industry that is ripe for innovation and growth. So there are some companies that exist now. So the one that Bill Gates has invested in and is most excited about is the one on the left on this slide, Beyond Meat. But there are other companies, Tofurky, Gardein, Impossible, Boca, Hampton Creek, other companies in plant proteins. But these companies all combined in terms of plant-based meats, as well as the other companies that exist, Garden Burger, Morningstar, etc., they add up to about $500 million a year. So there's massive opportunity for growth in this sector. Right now, about 70% of millennials report consuming plant-based meats at least a few times a week, which is good, and it shows the opportunity for that number. More than 70% are consuming animal-based proteins on a daily basis. 3 of the food tech startups that we're most excited about, I've mentioned a few of them already: Beyond Meat, which Bill Gates is invested in; Hampton Creek, which is invested in by Li Ka-shing, who is the richest guy in Asia; Impossible Foods, also Li Ka-shing. They have so far, just in the last 2 years, raised $400 million in venture capital, and they're valued at over $2 billion. So this is just in the last couple of years. The first commercial cultured meat company is Memphis Meats. Dr. Uma Valetti and Nick Genovese founded Memphis Meats about 8 months ago. And Memphis Meats went through the Indie Bio Food Accelerator and was one of 3 companies to, even before Demo Day, meet their seed round. They raised over $3 million in the course of about 3 months of fundraising because people are so excited about what they're doing. Dr. Valetti was a professor of cardiology at the University of Minnesota and a cardiologist. He was president of the Minnesota chapter of the American Heart Association, and he quit his job to move to San Francisco to put all of his time and energy into disrupting animal agriculture, along with Nick Genovese, who worked in his lab and is probably the foremost tissue engineer who's focused on on cultured agriculture. These 3 companies, which I talked about just a minute ago, Clara is doing plant-based egg proteins, Mufri is doing plant-based milk proteins, Gelzen is doing plant-based collagen/gelatin. These 2 companies have been around for less than 2 years. Gelzen started at the same time as Memphis Meats. They've already raised more than $10 million in venture capital. It's these folks who are invested in disrupting animal agriculture. So Bill Gates, who we talked about a little bit, Google co-founder Sergey Brin, who put the first $1 million into cultured meat via a lab at the University of Maastricht. And Bill Gates, again, what I was experiencing was more than a clever meat substitute. It was a taste of the future of food. So Kleiner Perkins, one of the really big venture capital firms, SOS Ventures, which focuses on biotech, Obvious Ventures, the Twitter guys, Khosla Ventures, Horizon Ventures, which is Li Ka-shing's VC firm, Li Ka-shing being the richest person in Asia. But it's not just the venture capitalists who are getting excited about the idea of plant-based and cultured alternatives to animal agriculture. Just this last January, I got my latest issue of Meeting Place magazine, which is, that actually is my the label for my issue of the magazine. But Meeting Place is a big meat industry journal. And the opening letter from the editor of Meeting Place magazine, so the first thing all of these people, the first thing they saw was Jim Perdue. And then they open it up, and the first content is Lisa Keith, Hormel's next acquisition. And it's all about the idea that people in the meat industry should be putting R&D resources and money into developing plant-based and cultured alternatives, as well as acquiring these companies, Hormel's next acquisition. So she said, rather than make and distribute only meat-based products, processors might redefine themselves as makers and distributors of protein products, then create or acquire companies and brands related to protein, regardless of origin. Meat production could do worse in the 21st century than to cozy up to smart investors like Bill Gates, Kleiner Perkins, and the constellation of other backers of plant-based and cultured companies. So we have VC and we have the meat industry. And at the Good Food Institute, the four things we focus on. One is basically finding and cultivating startups. Two is helping startups. Three is helping the more established plant-based companies to get into more restaurants and grocery stores. And then the fourth is outreach to big science foundations, outreach to governments, outreach to industry to try to free up some of the billions of dollars that are put into meat development, meat acquisition, looking at governments and their contributions to their desire to make positive strides on sustainability and climate change and educating them about the value of this sector. And it seems like we've got that. I want to step back just a moment to this slide and talk historically about when technology solved another problem. So the year is 1894, and if you Google the Great Horse Manure Crisis of 1894, you'll read a whole bunch of articles about the fact that developed cities across the world were covered in horse manure by 1894, and they were drowning in horse manure and plagued by flies, congestion, carcasses, and traffic accidents. So as one example, New York City, there were about 175,000 horses in New York City. They were producing 50,000 tons of manure every single month. And by 1897, there was a global conference in New York City, the first ever international urban planning conference, and they ended up calling it off because they couldn't figure out what to do about horse manure. It seemed an insurmountable problem as of 1897. In 1908, the Model T was introduced, so 11 years later, and by 1912, there were more cars than horses on the streets of New York City, and very quickly the horse manure problem was solved. Now we are on that same sort of cusp of a revolution in technology where food is concerned. And I'm convinced that in 35 years, people are going to look back at the inefficiency, especially the climate production problems, the animal welfare problems, the health problems of animal agriculture, and they will see growing crops to cycle them through animals so that we can eat animals as just as absurd as all of us in this room would see it to hop on a horse or get in a horse and buggy if we wanted to get to New York City or Kansas City or San Francisco. Technology is going to solve this problem. And that's what we're focused on at the Good Food Institute. For people who want more information, I would draw your attention to our resources page at thegoodfoodinstitute.org, thegoodfoodinstitute.org. Click on resources, and you will find academic lab opportunities for people who are interested in synthetic biology, academic papers who want a deeper dive on all the scientific issues of both plant-based and cultured products, job opportunities. We try to keep this up to date every month with all of the companies that we're talking about, but we also have links to all of the companies, their job pages, select popular media, so sort of an introduction to these topics, startup funding opportunities. So if any of you are entrepreneurial and would like to start a company, there is billions of dollars to be made in this space, and then a video gallery for people who learn in that way. And the main sort of take-home that I want to create, the main take-home for this talk is that animal agriculture is a huge problem, but it is an absolutely surmountable problem. We have the technologies that we need in order to address the problem. And all of you who are thinking about what your career path is going to be, there is both a lot of money to be made in disrupting animal agriculture and a tremendous amount of good that you can do by devoting yourself to making it equally delicious, equally convenient, and cost competitive for people to make choices that already align with their values. So that is Seeds of Disruption, Venture Capital, Technology, and the Future of Food. And I very much appreciate and am really pleased to have been here with you talking about it.